The title for my presentation today is Random Music for Control Freaks, Digital Clockwork for the Insecure. This refers to my experience creating the generative piece Nostalgia Nexus and what it has taught me about my own issues of composer control when I'm left alone with a computer keyboard or a Max patch. Having been a composer of completely structured works for many years, in the period immediately prior to COVID-19, I found myself increasingly involved with semi-structured and free improvisation. I am a member of a trio with Swiss musicians Roland Darenden, trombone, and Hildegard Kleeb, piano, where I improvise manipulation of acoustic instrumental source sounds. Some of you may remember that we performed at Electrons in 2019. I've also used Coranglais and sound processing to co-create two works with Jonathan Crossley, which both balance composition and improvisation in their own ways. The results of these collaborations have also been heard at Bose Electrons. As those of you who have heard me talk before will know, I've recently been interested in asynchronous online collaboration. I have created a file-sharing site called the Headroom Project that allows anyone who creates an account to musically develop an online seed planted on the site. Jonathan Crossley and I have also used a version of this site to chart the development of iterative collaboration of our work, Suite Inverse. Both sites are available and are most easily accessed by clicking through from my website, the address of which I will give at the end of this presentation. Coming from this perspective, my initial plan when considering how to approach my current project was to create an online browser-based piece that would contain a defined structure but material that could be altered within the structure. The piece would, by default, be populated with my own musical material, but this material could be overwritten or added to by online users accessing the piece and then working with it locally in their browsers. In both the situations of improvisation and online collaboration, I felt at ease with the way that material passes in and out of each participant's control. Therefore, I was struck by how much I have felt the need to control material and structure in this current project, which morphed from the idea of a generative, collaborative open system into what is currently a single authored piece, where I exclusively control the material, albeit one which will place the material in different relationships each time it is played. Initially, I decided that for such a browser-based piece to be possible using web audio, it would be best to restrict its technical aspects to the playing of recorded samples. Hence, the idea for a sample player piece was born. The next task was to decide how I would create the samples that would form the framework material for the piece. I began to look through recordings I had created over the years for my compositions, and I began to identify characteristics that would help me group them together as the piece's material. However, in doing this, I was struck by how nostalgic it made me feel, both of the sounds themselves and the memories of the works and times they evoked. Many of my hard drives are rather old by this point. I don't think that nostalgia is always a very healthy or positive creative impulse, but in this case, I decided to run with it. I believe that COVID-19 has caused much nostalgia for times when things were different, and also for people we have all lost. And I think that it could be positive to acknowledge this in a work without falling into the trap of living in the past or approaching it with rose-tinted spectacles. Having made the decision to embrace nostalgia in this piece, I then further decided to add a work by Schubert into the mix. Schubert is a composer I find myself constantly returning to for a variety of reasons. I took MIDI of a work by Schubert that I have a particular relationship with and which itself utilizes variation as a central aspect. I subjected its pitch material to randomized processes and then worked with sound processing to mold the results into material that fitted the groupings I utilize in Nostalgia Nexus. Although this material has been shaped into something quite different from the material of the original, I can still hear its phantom traces. I wonder if, after a few iterations of Nostalgia Nexus, you will be able to identify it too. To give you a taste of the music, I will now play the last minute or so of the end of one iteration of the piece. This is the same iteration that is included in the Bose Electrons concert. Nostalgia Nexus is then a generative sample-based piece that can be set to play for any duration and will be different every time its player is activated. It actually uses 21 sample players, 20 of which are linked in tandem and which can either play infinite loops, changing material, or individual samples. The remaining player creates the last sample of the piece. Each pair of players plays a different group of sounds. Sounds have been grouped in two ways, those that in my view progress well from one to another, and those that are best not heard against one another. There are two-player pairs that combine groups, but in all other cases, a sound will not be heard simultaneously with any other sound from its own group. Such sounds will only be heard serially. As you can see here, I undertook the grouping work by categorizing my material using Excel. I am worried about how much I enjoyed creating the spreadsheet and pledge to desist from such activity in the future. I've given each group of sounds a descriptive title. These are personal categories, essentially working titles, that really only existed to help me group the sounds. But nevertheless, I've decided to show the group titles along with the waveforms of the samples on the visualization of the player. The works of two composers were forefront in my mind during the development of Nostalgia Nexus. Simon Emerson's Memory Machine, created in 2010 and presented by Emerson at Bode Electrons in 2019, came to mind early on in the process. Similar to the current version of Nostalgia Nexus, Memory Machine is also based on a max patch player that plays randomized sounds that the composer has collected. I'm not sure, though, the extent to which generative processes balance random selection in this work. Probably a closer influence, though, are the generative players entitled Foot Low, 1998 to 2018, and Zielwaschen, 2003 to 2020, created by Austrian composer Karl-Heinz Essel. I first came across these works in 2006. While being struck by them at the time, I had not thought about them much in the intervening period until recently working on Nostalgia Nexus. In revisiting them now, I'm delighted to see that Essel has updated the players with contemporary versions currently available, and I'm struck by how much of the memory of especially Foot Low has acted as a subconscious model for me in creating Nostalgia Nexus. Both Zielwaschen and Foot Low are based on site-specific multimedia works that were originally presented live, and as such, are both generative pieces with a life of their own and also ingenious documentations of past projects. Zielwaschen is a closed generative player which generates sample playback for as long as it is open, or for 5 minutes if you have the unregistered version. Essel writes that Zielwaschen is a generative sound environment which was originally composed for an outdoor light installation by the German artist Rainer Gottmeier. Using the sound of one single bell stroke as its basic material, the piece unfolds a rich sonic cosmos by a computer program. Taking advantage of compositional algorithms that have been developed by Karl-Heinz Essel since the early 1980s, the piece is generated in real time. It can be perceived as a sonic organism, which might serve as a source for inspiration and meditation, running forever and ever. The piece neither requires nor offers any user interaction. It runs entirely on its own, driven by its internal compositional algorithms, which ensure variability and richness, even over a long time." End quote. It is interesting that Essel uses a bell as his source sound here, which of course has been a trope in electronic music, from Varèse's poem Electronique through to Harvey's Mortis Plango Vivos Voco, and more recently, as we have previously heard in Bode Electrons, our own Miles Warrington has reconstructed bells out of the sound of wind through invasive fir trees in the Cape in his 2017 work Fissurism. As such, the bell trope in electronic music is worthy of further study in its own right. Flow, on the other hand, groups sounds into 4 traditional elements: earth, wind, fire, and water, and dedicates a channel to each. Users can listen to the default automated versions of the piece, balance these channels manually, substitute their own samples for those contained in the element groups, or even add plugins to the playback channels. The digital player aims to evoke the nature of the original live piece. Essel writes in his program note, Originally, the soundscape formed the basis of a site-specific performance work in progress for Low that was carried out in numerous steps and took place in various locations with changing musicians from different fields like new music, experimental jazz, free improvisation, and new electronic music." End quote. The result for me is a very satisfying generative experience. In my own project, in order to separate the issue of working in the clunky and unartistic world of web audio from the structural design of the piece while reacting and working with the musical material itself, I decided to first create a prototype offline player using Max MSP, an environment that is more musical and with which I have a greater familiarity than web audio. The resulting player has formed a life of its own, which is slightly different from the envisaged web project, mainly due to the fact that it uses only the material I have chosen and doesn't facilitate user input beyond choosing the music's overall duration. In this way, it is a composition rather than a system of collaboration, and I have decided to create and make available a downloadable standalone app of this as the work Nostalgia Nexus. The web-based project will likely have different material and a different name, but nevertheless, I feel that the current Max player has served its purpose as a development tool as well. Taking a look at the Max patches for Nostalgia Nexus is a good way of seeing how the piece works. Those of you who are eagle-eyed will spot that I am using a rather old version of Max here. I have found that my method of visualizing waveforms by greatly speeding up the recording of sounds into visualization buffers does not work well in Max 7 and 8. It is also much easier to create standalone apps that are not unnecessarily large with Max 6 than it is with later versions. The player will work, however, in later versions of Max, and ultimately I will change my method of waveform visualization. I'm also going to add the possibility of scheduling the events of the piece externally using Open Sound Control so that graphic representations of the timeline of the piece can be created in applications such as the Yanix. This first screenshot shows the parent patch for the piece with the pairs of players for each group of sounds. The pair of players that plays the first samples of the piece is at the top right of the screen and has its own conditional logic and random generator. 1, 2, or 3 characteristic motives will be played in sequence by what I call the incipit mechanism. An accompanying sample or samples from another group may be heard as well, depending on which incipit or incipits was selected or were selected by the mechanism. This initial sequence occurs out of time. The coordinating clock that dictates the structure of a remaining piece only begins once the final incipit of the sequence has been triggered. Therefore, any version of Nostalgia Nexus will always be slightly longer than the duration chosen by the operator of the player. The second screenshot here is the subpatch that controls the unfolding of time in the main body of the piece. In many ways, this is effectively the score of the piece, as it provides both the order of events and when they will happen. The structure of this subpatch is expressed simply as proportions of the piece's total duration, which is a user-defined variable. The patch takes the total duration given by the user and then divides the duration into fractions. The results of these division operations provide the time triggers for the events to take place. For example, an early event is set to trigger a 38th of the way through the piece's total duration, at a duration of 13 minutes or 780 seconds, the duration I've chosen for the mode Electrons performance of this piece, will mean that the patch calculates the trigger point will be a little over 20 seconds from the beginning, which is 780 seconds divided by 38. The pair of players for the sound group linked to this event will play samples from the point they are triggered until a later event turns this particular player pair off. I think of the player pairs as rotating cogs in a clockwork mechanism. They are sort of performing the function of loops, but the specific material itself does not necessarily repeat unless the same sample is chosen consecutively or otherwise elsewhere in the mechanism during the life of the event's window. The patch relies on a clocker object that mechanically spits out time by the second that all calculated trigger points must obediently obey. In this last screenshot, we see the patch that chooses the specific samples to be played by the players. Each pair of players, and therefore each group of sounds, possesses one random number generator, which chooses a sound file from a predefined list. I found that structuring material in this way was very interesting. When composing, I normally adopt quite an organic process in terms of material. I believe I often follow an approach that leads to what Emerson calls abstracted syntax in music, where a consideration of the sonic nature of a material affects the way that material is used for structuring. While this was still the case in the creation and placement of the material into the constituent groups, the groups themselves are quite rigid, and the unknown quantity of which pieces of material from a group will be used made the process of structuring the material a lot more abstract than I'm used to. A reaction to this was that I found I engaged with playback of the early versions of the player a great deal, adding, changing, creating variations of material, and tweaking it in other ways after gaining oral feedback in the form of an iteration of a piece produced by the player. As such, I was really acting as a controller composer, composing many pieces simultaneously, just without the knowledge of which particular piece would see the light of day at any particular time. Therefore, the clockwork-like nature of the core workings of Nostalgia Nexus has made me think of what mechanical clockwork mechanisms are like literally, in both a somewhat negative and more positive way. On the one hand, I worry about the possible similarities between my system and mechanical automata, which appear to be flexible, living, and artistic things, but are actually following a set of complicated, rather than complex, prescribed mechanical rules. However, on the other hand, I've remembered more positive innovations. Amazing programmable mechanical devices, from Al Jazari's ancient castle water clock and Cara Stacey's creation of his perpetual flute machine, through to the internet sensation of Wintergarten's marble machine of 2016, the performance of which on YouTube goes way beyond the mechanical and is well worth a look. But the vision that came clearest to me, possibly because it is in the center of the Western canon of mechanical computing, is Charles Babbage's Difference Engine No. 2. It is the brass workings of this amazing machine, which was designed between 1847 and 1849, is Turing complete, meaning it is theoretically capable of expressing all tasks accomplishable by computers, though extremely slowly, and which possesses a mechanical memory that I have used as the graphic background for the Nexus player. One thing I love about this machine is that you can physically break it if you set up your calculation incorrectly. You have to be really sure of the calculation you are trying to attempt before you begin. While working in Max for Live 8 and trying to spread my 21 players across different channels of an Ableton set, I managed to crash my computer so spectacularly that it stayed worryingly blank and silent for many minutes before briefly flashing up an error message I've rarely, if ever, seen before. I felt this was a great achievement, and it made me feel as if I was dicing with the delicate cogs of Babbage's machine. It also was the final straw that sent me back to the standalone version of Max 6. Babbage's engines are so complex that they were never completely fabricated in his own lifetime. A working example of Difference Engine No. 2 was only completed in 1991 from Babbage's original plans. Possibly the best reason, however, to remember Babbage's machines is because of their link to Ada Lovelace and her evocation of poetical science. Ada Lovelace was the daughter of Lord Byron, and her mother's side of the family was so eager that she avoid the perceived madness and depravity of him that she received a very vigorous, rational education. This appears to have suited her well. She proved to be a talented mathematician, and in her late teens started to work with Babbage on the continued development of his difference engines. As part of this work, she often is credited with writing the first ever computer program, an algorithm for the difference engine to calculate the Bernoulli sequence. While this is disputed, it is certainly true that she published the first ever program as part of her extensive work on the engine. She also appears to have corrected Babbage's own algorithms and, crucially, did something that neither Babbage himself nor anyone else at the time did. She conceived a vision of the possibility of future multi-purpose computing machines. This was due to the fact that she understood the numbers that machines such as the difference engine calculated could represent things other than the numbers themselves. As Doran Swade stated, while Babbage and everyone else saw his engines as calculation machines, Lovelace's understanding of what the numbers could represent turned calculation into the idea of computation and general-purpose computing. This was possible because of her balance between the arts and the sciences as encapsulated in her concept of poetical science, which, would certainly have found resonance with, for example, the likes of Xenakis almost a century later. Despite her rational education, she was fascinated by the poetic and of the father she never knew. This balance of insight allowed her to see what others could not. Amazingly, from our point of view, one of the ways she explained her ideas for the potential of such computing was by essentially predicting the whole field of computer music. She wrote, "The analytical engine might act upon other things besides numbers, were objects found whose mutual fundamental relations could be expressed by those of the abstract science of operations, and which should also be susceptible to adaptations to the action of the operating notation and mechanism of the engine. Supposing, for instance, that the fundamental relations of pitch sounds in the science of harmony and of musical composition were susceptible to such expression and adaptations, the engine might compose and elaborate pieces of music of any degree of complexity or extent." End quote. Returning to the present and the possibilities that Lovelace's predicted field gives us. Although I have been quite controlling in the preparation and structuring of the material for Nostalgia Nexus, the continuing renditions of the music produced by the player still manage to surprise me. Each rendition contains moments that I really enjoy and feel to me well paced, and also corners that I would love to go in, clear up, and make musically tidy. My guess is, though, that each listener will judge the locations of each of these extremes differently, and I'm managing to deal with my control issues to the extent that an untampered, unique rendition of Nostalgia Nexus's music features in this festival, and others can be found on my website. If you are interested in doing so, please go ahead and download the player yourself and see what it produces for you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a most wonderful introduction to your work. May I pitch one or two questions at you, or direct them at you, please?
Absolutely, yeah, please do.
First question is whether the point where you've arrived at now, working with this system, automaton, or whatever one wants to call it, I'm unsure. Did you arrive at this point by following a trajectory of any particular sort? So were you unhappy with not satisfied with compositional solutions and procedures that you uncovered in a more traditional sense whilst composing, and did this drive you towards a more, I wouldn't like to use the word automated, but towards a more mechanically inspired process? How does this trajectory, what does it consist of?
The main motivation is to work with interactive web applications. So the reason I wanted to develop this was because I'm interested in seeing how much of a satisfying artistic and kind of direct experience we can have in art using the web and audio. Web audio is quite a powerful thing behind in web browsing. Of course, it's cross-platform and all the rest of that, which is why it's so useful. But there's very little that has been done systematically to develop web audio to make it a tool that is usable by artists, and therefore that we can get the best range of creativity working through the web in that way. And that's the main thing I'm interested in. You know, that there have been some really great innovations on using sound on the web that have come very close to making it possible for us all as artists to work, but they never quite catch on. The French did what was called the pedal project. I forget exactly what it was called, because it was based around the idea of modular guitar pedals. And they've got this patching mechanism where it looks a little bit like a patching program, but you can do quite a lot. And as part of that, they made a systematic template for web audio plugins, so that anybody could create a plugin which could be used on the website, and you could pick them up and you could share them and use them like plugins on a DAW. And it all works. It's just so few people, as far as I can tell, have taken it up, that it's in danger of becoming a kind of abandonware situation. And there's many examples. I mean, Heavy converting max patches into JavaScript essentially that can then run web audio is another one that no longer is being supported. And so I was interested, if we use the tools that are available to us and are easy to available to us, what can we make? What can we make at the current time? Which is why, as I mentioned, I was interested in a sample-based piece, because running samples is one of the ways that we can do on the web. How much can you do with that? How can the intelligent sampling, choice and processing of samples allow us to create an interesting experience? I think the other thing, I think live performance is always the best. As Leilande said earlier, let's get him down here and hear his music with him and some speakers in a room. Let's do that for everybody, and that's coming next year. But in the interim, we've all got interested in how musical can this remote situation be. Even when we're all together, though, of course, ever since the beginning of electroacoustic music, people have been trying to find ways of making a fixed medium more performative and more fresh each time. And he talked about sound diffusion and spatialization. The other way is by it not being quite the same each time, like a live performance isn't. So although this is automated, like a live performance, we know you're not going to get the same thing, and that's kind of fun. Yeah.
Yes. Oh, indeed. It's very stimulating. It's artistically speaking, very satisfying. You mentioned the word samples, which brings me to the idea, or the sound side of all of this. Am I correct if I say, when I say that much of the work that you're currently doing has to do with the construction of a composition, the unpredictable outcome that follows a composition process that is concerned with structure and less with sound itself? Is that correct, or am I completely wrong?
I think that's part of what I was delving into in my presentation, that I'm interested by how much I appear not to be willing to cede control of structure, but and the fact that I feel like I want to group the sounds in order to have some control over that also means that I'm thinking about the sounds themselves as well, which I mentioned, that balance between abstract and abstracted syntax that Emerson discusses. Right. I did make initially a player which was just a dual loop. It was only one pair, and I put all of the sounds that I collected and I was interested in it, to see what would happen. And I was very unhappy with the result, which is why I ended up with 21 of them, because I wanted to be able to create structure across and decide when to access one or other of them, which I knew ahead of time because of the groupings would take me to certain places. And that grouping required me to scrutinize sounds from my own compositions of the past, but also from this particular Schubert piece that I randomized the MIDI of. Basically, I took the MIDI, randomized it so that there are bits of it that are closer in pitch content than others, but they've all got a kind of ghost skeleton of the original pitches, but the pitches are not the same. Yeah.
Right. Yes. So I may have missed it in your presentation, but this means that the visual element that we saw, this abstraction of graphic abstraction art that accompanied the soundtrack or the music, the composition, the visual component at this point in time that isn't composed in real time. It is not.
No, so the background. Reactive? Yeah. The background, the sort of greenish background, is an adaptive form of someone who had, and I've credited you'll see on the concert tonight that you'll see where the video comes from. It's from California when they had the Babbage machine there. It's a processed video of Babbage's machine working, and it's on a kind of loop. But the sound forms that pop up, the sound waves that pop up, waveforms on top of that, that's all happening in real time. Yeah.
I see. I'm scouring here through the chat, and I'm not seeing any open questions. Cameron, thank you.
I will just make one errata.
Yes.
I said that I'd use Mac 6 so that I could do certain things and make it more stable. When I was actually putting the app together, which is now on my website so that people can generate this and see what comes up for them, Mac 6 didn't work at all. I couldn't get, it made the app nicely, but it won't play on any computer like prior to 1890. I mean, it could play on Babbage's machine, but not on a Mac from. So it's now in Max 8. It means you can't see the waveforms on the current version of the app. We've got little waveform meters, and you can see the sound pop up, but not as waveforms. In some ways, I think it looks it looks neater that way in any case. But it does mean that hopefully the app will work on a modern day Mac at least. Yeah.
Indeed. The perpetual challenge that one faces is the compatibility.
Absolutely. So you have to keep on top of it all the time, or it gets you.
Yeah.
But thanks so much, Theo, and thanks again for an amazing Bode Electrons. Already on day one, we've heard so much, and looking forward to the rest of it. It's really cool.
Thank you, Cameron. Keep well then. Bye.
Thanks. Cheers. Bye.